And I think we're running pretty much to time, so our next speaker is again on the theme of decision making, but our next speaker looks at decision making from a hindsight point of view and how we can consider decision making in post-incident reviews. So Professor Michael Eburn is an associate professor with the Australian National University, but I think recently moving to the United Kingdom on sabbatical. And Michael will be speaking to his presentation, Reviewing High Risk and High Consequence Decisions, Finding a Safer Way. Please welcome Mr. Professor Michael Eburn.
Come on. Okay, thank you. We're at a wildland fire safety summit, and I want to say that the aim of my talk is not about a technique or a process to make the fire ground safer, but to make it's safer for firefighters to engage in a post-event inquiry process. And can I also, at the start, acknowledge Rebecca Fox, who's in the audience and who spoke earlier, who was a presenter at a facilitated learning analysis course I did with the US Forest Service. And thank you to the Bushfire and Natural Hazards CRC for funding that. And much of what comes from here started with the learning I got from the Forest Service FLA course. So, what I'm talking about, particularly from an Australian context, but I'm sure it's reasonably universal, is not the sort of inquiries or reviews that a fire agency does after an operation when they look back and go, well, how did we go? What could we have done better? I'm talking about the inquiries, the very formal inquiries that might occur after a major and catastrophic fire, where there's been a loss in the community, a significant loss in the community, significant loss of trust and faith in the community, in whether it's the emergency services or the government, and there's a public inquiry. In Australia, we tend to go with what's called a royal commission, but every jurisdiction will have its own version of these big inquiry events. And we know that what's being reviewed are, to use the title of the workshop, high risk, high consequence decisions. And you know better than I that those decisions are made with little time and incomplete information. You have, to tie in with the previous speaker, a fire on a catastrophic fire weather day. The risks are incredibly high, decisions have to be made, and sometimes the outcome is less than desirable. I don't want to say that mistakes are made. If it's a high-risk decision, it might be we have a number of choices here, we can't be sure which way they're going to go, they all have the potential that things will go very badly, and maybe it does. Doesn't mean the risk assessment was wrong, just that it's a bad day. But after the event, there is a demand for the review. And we hear various motivations. There's a couple. Why are we holding this review? Is it to identify lessons that might be learned? Is it a classic quote from governments, we're going to make sure this never happens again, failing to recognise, of course, that catastrophic fire weather will happen again, and fires will happen again, and decisions will have to be made again. What we hope is that the purpose of one of these very high level of inquiries is to determine what we can learn from the examination and what we need to do to prevent or mitigate another like event. That's the idealised hope that we think that governments are doing when they insist on calling an inquiry. But the literature shows that there are many more motivations going on. It might be to show concern about an issue. You're suddenly faced with a situation where there's been a fire, people have died, homes have been lost. The government's got to be able to say, we're with you. So we'll hold an inquiry to show how seriously we're taking the matter. It might be to simply give an illusion of doing something, which is related to this one down here about delaying decision making. We don't know what happened either. There's been a terrible thing. If we call an inquiry, we actually don't have to make any decisions for a while. We can wait for the inquiry to come out. Everybody will be calmer. This will be off the front page of the news. Something else will be catching people's attention. We can think about it then. It can show, a government might be wanting to show responsiveness to a problem. Again, if there's political pressure, what are you going to do? Well, hang on, let's do this. It makes us look like we're doing something. You co-opt your critics. All the people who are being critical about it, you suddenly have to go off and give their evidence to the inquiry. You can reduce opposition, because whenever someone wants to criticise the government, they can go, oh, I'm sorry, we can't comment on that. That's before the inquiry. And suddenly the heat gets taken out, pun intended, of the debate. Reassert control of the policy agenda. Or as some of the other literature says, recreate the image that you're in control. Governments need to convince people they're in control. The fact that a fire occurred, if I take the Australian example from 2009 where 173 people died, the community is outraged. So you can say, we're in control here. We're going to have the inquiry, we're going to reintroduce everything. It's all right, we're in control. And if I might be so bold, the appearance is that someone in the fire service got it wrong, we'll fix that. So it's trying to recreate the myth of control. So there's some of the motivations. Now, of course, no one calls an inquiry and says we're doing it for these reasons. They always say we're doing it so we can identify the lessons and this will never happen again. But the literature suggests there's a lot more going on. It's a high-risk decision, but, perhaps it should say but instead of and, in contemporary risk societies, chance, accident or tragedy are no longer accepted as explanations. Someone must be blamed for their occurrence. It's not really an acceptable answer to go, yeah, it was just a really bad day and bad things happen. In fact, the former Australian Prime Minister got into a great deal of trouble for saying just that when an Australian soldier was killed in Afghanistan or Iraq, and his comment was making it a bit more polite than the way he said it, but was basically bad things happen. And that was an unacceptable answer. There had to be somebody to blame. So we fall into, in these large inquiries, an almost inevitable desire to apportion blame. Some of that is part of the human emotion. If I can be so bold to my professional colleagues, because I'm not sure that I said it or it was clear, I'm not a firefighter, I'm a lawyer, I'm an attorney. So I look at the legal responses to fire. So my professional brethren tend to fall back on, there we go, old habits. If you're a lawyer and you're used to representing your client and protecting your client's interests, and perhaps making sure your client doesn't say anything that's going to be used against them in subsequent proceedings, you may be appearing before an inquiry where the tribunal has said, as they tend to say, this is not a fault-finding exercise, we're here merely to discover the truth. No one will be blamed. And the lawyers go, yeah, well, we're still not going to say anything, thanks very much. We fall back on our old techniques. Behave like lawyers and seek to protect our clients' interests. The stated aim may be to avoid blame, but that is hard to avoid, as one of the Australian coroners investigating a fire that killed 9 people said, it's very easy to, whenever you've done it, you can always find someone to blame, and he was cautioning himself against not doing that, but it is certainly something that's very easy to do. We had major fires in Australia in 2003 that burned into the national capital. The coroner investigating those fires said that sometimes that's just the right thing to do. When you've heard the inquiry, if there's someone to blame, you've got to blame them. In that particular instance, the coroner made recommendations finding that 3 senior officers from the fire service and the chief minister, in America you might call them the governor, I guess. I'm not sure in Spain what would be the equivalent position. But the chief minister was also to blame. It then took 10 years of court cases for the courts to go, actually no one was at fault here, after the coroner had made these recommendations. So the stated aim may be to avoid blame, but that's hard to achieve. 5 minutes, so I'll speed up a bit. Now here's the critical point in terms of our context. The blame-seeking inquiries are causing harm. Many emergency responders experience the review process as more taxing than the critical event itself, said these authors in a review on paramedics, and there are some papers that me and some other people have written together, making the point that a firefighter or paramedic who's gone through these traumatic events then has to relive it in these inquiries that take a very long time, is being traumatised not by the fire, but by the post-event inquiry. And so what I wanted to do, and my colleagues wanted to do, is find a way that might assist them and make the post-event inquiry safer. Because the other thing about a blame-seeking inquiry is, if I can work out how to make this thing work, is they don't actually help with learning. It's a key impediment to organisational learning. Because it immediately causes people to shut down. We had a terrorist siege in Sydney, I can't remember when. There's a coronial inquiry going on, and the whole issue became whether the notes taken by police in their post-event review would be released to the inquiry. And the police objected, saying if we knew that was what was going to happen, we would never sit around and honestly come up with things where you go, oh my goodness, did I bugger that up? Did I get it wrong? Because they can't be that honest. Now, in that case, fortunately, the court said no, none of those notes would be released to the inquiry. The judge ruled that. But it will change the way people talk about events if they think they're going to be pulled up before the inquiry. Secondly, inquiries produce recommendations that are counterfactual. They go, if you'd done this, the problem would have been solved, but of course you don't know what would have been the outcome of that event. They may not be directed to relevant players. Our inquiries tend to give directions to governments. They don't address what did the community do, how did the people respond. They focus, of course, on a particular event, and they are limited by their terms of reference. And it's an old adage, no government calls an inquiry without at least knowing what the answer is going to be before they start and making sure they write the terms of reference to get the answer they want. I say that with due respect to our chair, who has chaired some of the inquiries at a slightly lower level than the ones I'm talking about. Importantly, they don't let people tell their story. If what happens is you get, again, to use an Anglo-Australian legal picture, the people don't get to tell their story. They get put in a box where they get to answer questions that someone else asks, and the person only asks the questions that they want to be answered. The person doesn't get to say what happened. No lawyer puts a witness in the witness box and says, just tell me your story. Oh, and then the result gets delivered from a bench, the judge. So everyone gets to answer their questions, and a judge decides what the wisdom is and hands it back to the service. I will tell you, the state of Victoria, or whichever state you're in whichever country you're in, what you are going to do or should do. So we're suggesting that actually what we need is an alternative. And what we've looked at is this idea of restorative practice, and it comes from criminal law. And what it recognises is that when you have an event like a crime or a major disaster, what you're actually suffering is a disruption to the community and break. So, for example, you might have a community where a volunteer fire department exists. There's great trust between the community and the fire service. The fire comes, people die, houses are lost, we've been let down, and the trust is broken. And the firefighters, who have for years had this close relationship, are suddenly being condemned, and this has been reported out of these fires, and no longer part of the community, are also being injured. What we need to do is restore that, hence restorative practices. Here's just an example of what it might look like. A face-to-face encounter between those affected. the community, the firefighters, facilitated by a trained mediator whose role, unlike a royal commissioner or a coroner, is not to impose an interpretation, but to encourage everyone to tell their stories, express their feelings, ask questions, to have the firefighters and the community explain to each other what was going on. So when the community says, but you didn't come, the firefighters can say, yeah, but this is what was happening in our world. Rather than the current model where the fire service story tends to be told by the chief officer. Firefighters give their story to the fire department's lawyers who break it all up and it delivers a statement and the chief officer speaks on behalf. The firefighters are not being heard at the local level. Why might this be a good idea? Because it can recognise that, in fact, what we are having is a breakdown of relationships as a result of this event. Because it allows emotions to be expressed. It allows people, everybody, to be heard. And it allows for the inquiry, when it's hearing that story, for example, at a very simple level, when people say, but to the fire service, but you didn't do this, the fire service can say, which you can't really do in a coroner's or royal commission, it's just not acceptable, to the landowners and the homeowners, yeah, but you didn't do your bit. What were you doing? And so everyone can tell their story. Inquiries rarely, our formal inquiries very rarely make recommendations because they can't be enforced about the community. No Royal Commission is going to say people have to do this. It's going to say the state has to encourage people to act. Whereas if it's a restorative justice practice held at a local level, people in the community might hear from their emergency responders and governments and the whole agencies, this is how your decisions affected us and the outcome in a way that they're not being heard. And the critical question for me, how am I going? I'm down to one? That's it. The critical question for me and the critical question for this summit, and the reason I'm talking is what I'm saying here, what I'm proposing to you, is not designed to make the fire ground safer. It's not about the fire ground. It's about asking, if we did something like this, would it be safer for responders and communities after the event? Would it allow responders and communities, individuals within those communities, to come together to share an understanding of what happened, not at the state level, but in their town, in their community, about what happened, the role everybody played, the experiences that everybody had, including the firefighters, who will no doubt report things of their own experience. Just to tell one story that's in our discussion paper. In the Victorian Bushfires Royal Commission, someone was invited to tell her story about the experience. She talked about how unfair it was. The fire service warned some people, but not her. No one came to her. But no one then got the firefighters from that little community and said, tell us what was happening in your day. Tell us where you got to. Tell us what you were trying to do. And it may have been, we don't know, it may have been that have told the story, we were trying to warn everybody, but it was a really bad fire day, and at some point we had to draw the line and back out. We don't know. We don't know the answer. Similar story from the 2003 Canberra fires, when a fire team left a village, and the people in the village were suddenly outraged. There'd been a fire service there and they all packed up and left. Of course, they all packed up and left because at the end of the day, they knew they weren't going to be able to do anything and they had to deploy their resources. But that sort of hearing each other is not going on when you have the formal sort of inquiry. And as I said, with due acknowledgement to you, and who's hosted some post-event inquiries, and the picture is perhaps changing, but not for these catastrophic events that will happen again, where someone will want to call a Royal Commission. All right, so you're tagging me on time, so my last point on the slide is to give you a reference to a discussion paper that's currently available on the Bushfire and Natural Hazard CRC website, where we explore these issues in more detail. And we'd certainly be interested if anybody had any thoughts on what we've written and on whether what we're proposing is a sensible proposal.
And I thank Michael for the concept and introducing the thinking around restorative justice. It's just a pity that the Minister who opened and made some welcoming remarks perhaps couldn't be here to listen to that approach, because it's decision makers at that level who need to understand the principle. Unfortunately, we're out of time, so there might be a chance to talk to Michael during the lunch break. It's deliberately a long lunch break, but I'd ask you to again thank Michael for his wonderful presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. And contact details are there if anybody wants them.